I've been asked by some clients and some colleagues to give an update on the overall aspects of failed hip implant litigation and where we stand here now, many years down the road from the announcement of the first major recall of a hip implant. Going all the way back to the mid-2000s, the major culprit in the problem, the overall problem, was metal-on-metal bearing surfaces. Biomet, DePuy, Zimmer, Wright Medical, all were big players in the metal-on-metal bearing surface market. Metal-on-metal bearing surface essentially is when you have a one-piece metal shell that fits into the hip, and you have one significant giant metal head. Those two articulate with each other and form the new hip joint that replaced the arthritic one for the patient. And the rubbing together of those two metal surfaces would cause metal ions and metal wear debris to get in the tissues around the hip, and then the hip would get painful. Pseudotumors would form, large fluid collections would form, and they had to be removed. The implants had to be removed. Essentially, those litigations have played themselves out. There was a phase 1 and phase 2 settlement program for DePuy ASR. For Biomet, there's been a very large settlement program. For Zimmer Durham, there's a very large settlement program. There is still some ongoing litigation with Wright Medical over its metal-on-metal bearing surfaces. And then Biomet, likewise, there's been a fairly large settlement of the M2A Magnum cases, and that's winding down. The only major metal-on-metal bearing surface litigation that exists and remains today is the DePuy Pinnacle litigation. That litigation is pending before Judge Kincaid in the federal system. The MDL is in Dallas, Texas, before Judge Kincaid. There are many thousands of cases that are filed. DePuy never recalled the Pinnacle metal-on-metal hip. It did recall the DePuy ASR XL. It never recalled the Pinnacle system. To date, DePuy has taken the position that there will be no settlement of that case, that they're going to try as many cases as they have to until either the plaintiffs give up or they win enough where the plaintiffs just kind of go away. That generally doesn't happen in these cases, that kind of rhetoric we hear all the time. The sheer weight of the litigation is substantial, and I believe that the judge there and judges in other jurisdictions are not going to allow DePuy to just sit back and try cases until the cows come home. So at some point in time, there probably will be some meaningful discussions about resolving those cases. Separate and apart from the bearing surface failures, where we stand today on what I'll call round 2 of major hip implant failures, we have the bimodular hip designs by Stryker and by Wright Medical. That's where the femoral stem essentially, instead of being one piece, is two pieces with a removable neck. We saw substantial problems with Stryker's Rejuvenate and ABG2 designs, where the stem was made out of this really soft titanium called TMZF, and the necks were made out of chromium and cobalt. Where the neck inserted into the stem, we saw significant corrosion. Again, same result. The patients suffered from metal wear disease, and the hips had to come out. The difference in that litigation and with those two products, the Rejuvenate and the ABG2, is the stem had to come out as opposed to just the bearing surface coming out. So that was very traumatic to the patients. The surgery to remove a femoral stem is very involved and challenging for the surgeon, and it's fraught with difficulty. Intraoperative femur fractures, the need to do extended trochanteric osteotomies, abductor muscle dysfunction, and all kinds of problems intraoperatively can happen when you remove a femoral stem. The other bad thing about that is you have to replace it with what's called a revision stem. Revision stems are really not manufactured or designed to go in as primary stems. They're salvage devices. What you have to do to put one of those in is you have to ream a bigger hole down in the femur that's generally longer than the other hole was, and the stems are much longer and much bigger around. So that's not what a patient wants. The patient wants a good working primary stem, which is small, like the one I showed a minute ago, as opposed to a big clunky one that's long and big and fat. The Stryker litigation right now, phase 1 settlement was entered into in November of 2014. It's pretty much played itself out. There are still a few issues with some enhanced benefit awards and some lost wage claims. But other than that, that is pretty much mature and phased out. That was same with the ABG2. It was included in that same settlement. Phase 2, there has been a registration order entered by the court. So anybody who had people who were revised after November the 4th of 2014 had to register their clients. That doesn't mean that that's an enrollment. It doesn't mean that there's a settlement coming. It simply is nothing more than a census before the court to get a count of how many people exist out there. If I were a betting man, because of the way round 1 was handled and Stryker's desire to resolve this litigation, I would predict that there will be a round 2 that will happen. I just can't predict when it will happen. And then you're looking at a little bit of right medical litigation over the ProFemur. I actually have one of those down here somewhere. It's another bimodular stem that looks like this, that has the neck that fits down in it. This is actually a ProFemur that fractured. There's some ProFemur fracture cases going on. There's also some ProFemur corrosion cases going on, very similar to the Rejuvenant and the ABG2. Right Medical, when they had these fracture problems, this is a titanium neck on a titanium stem. The titanium necks would corrode and then break. So Right Medical came up with the brilliant idea that they would just exchange this titanium neck out and they would start using chromium cobalt. Well, chromium cobalt has, when it's mated with titanium in this kind of a construct, has all the problems that the Rejuvenant and the ABG2 had. So instead of their Right Medical's devices breaking like this, Right Medical's devices started corroding and poisoning people, so they had to come out. There is litigation around the country revolving around both Right Medical fracture and corrosion cases. So that's kind of round 2 of metal wear disease failures. Round 3, we're starting to see some of that developing right now, where the medical community and the scientific community has figured out that they could have a problem at a different part in the construct. In the old days, the go-to tried and true construct was a one-piece titanium stem and a one-piece metal head like that. That interfaced with a plastic cup on this side, and then there was a one-piece metal shell that this cup snapped into. That went into the acetabulum. This goes in here, and that's your new hip joint. Well, this is metal on plastic, plastic on metal. That sounds pretty safe, but you still have a metal on metal connection in that kind of a construct. Over the years, the medical and scientific community started calling for and developing larger and larger and larger femoral heads. As you can see, the one in my left hand here to your right is much larger than the one in my right hand here, like by 100%. In the old days, 32 millimeters and less was the go-to standard. Somehow or another, they convinced doctors, the companies convinced doctors that bigger heads were better. For some reason, they said it would, result in less dislocations, more stable construct, none of which was supported by scientific literature or experience. But doctors started using them, and the larger heads, when impacted onto these stems, this creates a much larger torque at this interface. Motion results. Motion is bad. When the motion starts, you get corrosion. Body fluids start tracking down the sides of the trunnion. When you combine body fluids with corroding metal, you get a pH that's very, very low and an environment that promotes even more corrosion. And so patients can get poisoned by that construct in exactly the same way as patients are getting poisoned by the phase 2 cases I talked about and the phase 1 cases I talked about. So what I think you're going to see in the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years in hip implant litigation is some scrutiny with regard to various companies' products where their metal head, their large metal heads, when put on their titanium stems, cause metal wear disease, just like all the other bearing surface products did and the dual modulars. So keep an eye open for that.